Good afternoon. Welcome to a special session of the Delaware County Board of Supervisors this day, Monday, July 19th, 2021. It is 1 o'clock and we're going to open up this special session meeting. Kylie, could you please take roll?
Supervisor Hemmingsen,
I'm here.
Supervisor Starkey. Here. Supervisor Short,
Here.
Supervisor Berkowitz. Here. Chair Howard.
And so we'll just have a brief moment of reflection. Thank you. Supervisor Starkey, please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So glad we're back in unison.
All right, I'd like to open it up for public comment. Any members of the public wishing to address the board, please limit your comments to 3 minutes or less. Kylie, do we have anybody online?
Chair, I'm not seeing any at this time.
All right, then we'll move beyond public comment and move directly into item number 4 on our agenda, which is the American Rescue Plan update. Neil?
Yes, Chair. I believe we have Greg Burns from Thorn Run Partners today for a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation of the American Rescue Plan and the local recovery funds and its allowable uses for Delaware County.
Very good. Good afternoon, Greg.
Chair, I'm not seeing Greg on yet. I see that he has, oh, here he comes. Okay. Looks like his partner maybe is coming on.
Good afternoon, Greg. Can you hear us? Very
I can.
good.
How are you?
We're doing terrific today. How about yourself?
Very well, thanks. Apologies for the delay.
Yeah, not a worry at all. We know you guys are busy back in DC, but we are now on the agenda item. We were just waiting for you to tune on in. So if you'd like, we could have Neil kick it off, but I believe this is your show. So please begin if you'd like.
Neil, do you want to kick it off or shall I just get started?
No, go ahead, Greg. I introduced you before you came on.
Got it. Apologies.
No problem.
The way it should be, I suppose. No. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to participate in this conversation. We're here to talk about the American Rescue Plan and specifically the state and local funding that you all have already received and are going to begin to figure out how to allocate throughout the community. So I want to go ahead and share my screen, which has a presentation that I'll walk through. And then, I think from our perspective, we're hoping to inform you today about the opportunity and about the potential with respect to these funds that you'll be receiving. And then we also want to, solicit feedback from the board and members of the community who are interested, and, ultimately help you all determine how you most appropriately want to utilize these funds. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Apologies. You'd think I would be more advanced about this. Apparently I have to grant access on my Mac. Shoot. This must be the first time I've tried to share access on my computer. Oh my gosh.
Much for those cat-like reflexes.
Yeah. How do you do this? Ganeve, any chance you can do this more easily than I can?
I'm gonna check. Usually the host will have to let you give access to share your screen.
Rachel?
I think that's the
We're
case.
examining that right now. You have the authority to share, Greg, so it's all on your plate.
Right. No, I know. Unfortunately, my computer won't let me do it. Let's see if, I can see it right here. I'm going to be able to do this. Hang on one sec. I'm sorry. I don't think I've shared my screen with this newer computer, so I apologize, but it looks like I am Okay, I actually need to exit and I'm going to come right back.
You bet.
It's making me quit and reopen this tab, and then I'll be able to come right back. Hang on one moment. All right, let's see if this works. I apologize. I'm so sorry. We should have prepped this beforehand. That's my fault. So there we go. Hopefully you all can see that.
We can. Thanks,
Okay,
Greg.
great. All right. So again, apologies for the technical difficulties. This won't happen again. I can say that. So again, we're going to be talking about the American Rescue Plan and state and local funds and how you all may choose to spend them. So there's a couple of things that we want to walk you through today. And for some reason, this is not, I want to make sure you guys can see the whole screen. The whole
This is
slide.
good from our end, Greg. Thank you.
Good. So we're going to talk about the rescue plan. Then we're going to talk about some of the other federal assistance that has been delivered throughout the nation, both via the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, because I think it's important for the board to understand that as you make decisions on how you might spend your ARP state and local funding, it's also important to recognize that there has been a lot of other assistance already provided, both in your community specifically, but nationwide to a whole host of interests. And I think that's really important for all of us to understand as we make the decisions about how best to allocate your local funds. We then want to talk specifically about what the eligible categories of funding are with respect to how the Department of Treasury has indicated you can spend your state and local funding. We're going to talk a little bit about reporting requirements, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps and solicit feedback from you all. So of course, as you know, the American Rescue Plan was passed earlier this year. It does include $350 billion nationwide for what's known as the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. These are funds that are administered through the Department of Treasury. They have a crazy long acronym that I'm not going to use very often. Instead, I'm more than likely going to call them state and local funds throughout this presentation and later on. So far, the Department of Treasury, upon making these funds available within the past couple of months, has also issued what they're terming an interim final rule that helps define what some of the eligible uses are for the funds that you'll receive. Public comments on those interim regulations were actually due on Friday. Many of the state and local national organizations like the National Association of Counties, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities have all submitted comments on behalf of their member agencies that were informed by the discussions that they've had thus far about the funds. So Treasury over the next several weeks will work through those comments and deliver a final set of recommendations and guidance. At the same time, they continue to develop frequently asked questions documents that they update on a periodic basis. And I would guess off the top of my head, they probably have made 5 or 6 updates to those frequently asked questions over the past 2 months or so. So with respect to the broad funding, the state and local funds, it's also important to note that these funds are not necessarily, you're not being asked to or forced to spend them right away. You have a wide latitude to spend your local funds. It's meant to cover the period between March 3rd, 2021, which is when the American Rescue Plan was signed into law, through the end of essentially 2024. And you must have a plan to spend them by that date, but you don't actually have to expend all of the funds until 2026. So keep in mind that these, while you're going to have these funds in 2 allocations over the first 2 years, you have more time to spend them. So there doesn't necessarily need to be a massive rush to spend them right now. or even in the next 18 months, for instance. So I think that's an important point that we'll want to think about later as we make decisions. Broadly speaking, and we're going to delve into each of these, funding can be used in 5 different ways. So you can support the public health response, you can address the negative impacts to the economy and to your local economy from the pandemic. Under some narrow circumstances, you can replace public sector revenue loss. What we're finding, and I'll talk about this more later, is that most entities that I engage with are not able to use this provision based on the rules that Treasury has thus far put out with respect to this particular use. You are allowed to provide what's known as premium pay for so-called essential workers. And last but not least, you are specifically allowed to make investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. It should be noted that Congress actually specified those types of infrastructure, and they do not allow you to use the money on things like transportation infrastructure. Before we get into those 5 things and start to talk in detail about each of those, I just want to remind everybody on the board and in the public about the other kinds of funding that has been made available. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just meant to remind everybody that there obviously is a lot of other significant assistance that's been provided to all kinds of entities, whether individuals, businesses, or more, through both the American Rescue Plan, again, that was passed back in March, as well as through the CARES Act, which was passed during the prior administration. So those things include direct checks that many of your constituents received from the federal government. I think in some cases, I believe that there were 2 rounds of checks, if I recall. There also, of course, were a number of unemployment benefits that were expanded for many people. So some people who were benefiting from traditional unemployment or who were laid off because of the pandemic had opportunities to, at least hopefully stay stable through the economic transition through enhanced unemployment assistance. We also had a number of programs that helped businesses. And again, these are just a few of them, but they include things like the Paycheck Protection Program. Almost $1 trillion in the Paycheck Protection Program was provided to businesses. Now, these are known as forgivable loans. So it's essentially as long as the businesses use the funds in ways that were allowable, then the loans are forgiven. And so the federal government fully expects that the vast majority of these funds will be forgiven. These loans will be forgiven. So that's almost $1 trillion in assistance to businesses of all types. There's also, I'm jumping actually down to the 3rd bullet here, or the 3rd item, which is called the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. This was a specific loan program through the Small Business Administration that also provided forgivable loans to small businesses and actually nonprofits. So if you were a nonprofit, you were also eligible for these forgivable loans. There was a $15 billion shuttered venues grant. Now, I know that program in particular has had some challenges. I'm not sure that actually the funds have been paid out yet, but it is available. They are anticipating it. And shuttered venues, can be things like theaters, for instance, to concert halls or something. So I don't know how many of those types of facilities you may have in Del Norte, but there might be a couple of entities that potentially could benefit from that opportunity as well. And last but not least, restaurants in particular had a specific fund created for them that was separate and apart from the Paycheck Protection Program or the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. So restaurants were actually eligible for both of those programs. Some of them took advantage of those. Then they were also made eligible for the revitalization fund specific to restaurants. Many of these funds I will mention, though, have run out of funding, and I don't believe that Congress has discussed in any great detail providing a lot of additional funding to these programs in the short term. So I believe the Paycheck Protection Program is fully spent. The restaurant program is fully spent. And I'm not 100% sure of the other 2, but I believe the shuttered venues grant, even though the money hasn't actually flowed to the recipients yet, is also essentially all been spoken for. So again, that's just a snapshot of really quickly of some of the other assistance that's been provided nationwide, so that as you all begin to think about ideas within the community essentially you can try to keep in mind that you're not, trying to provide assistance to entities that may have already received it in one way or another. So again, I mentioned those 5 categories among the state and local funds on how you could spend the funds. We're going to walk through each of those now to try to talk a little bit more depth about how you can use those funds within each category. So the first one that I mentioned was supporting the public health response. So this is pretty broad, and you can see that in the box with all the bullet points. There are a couple important things I think that we should mention that are specifically, in my mind, related to Del Norte County with respect to supporting the public health response. So within this sort of broad range of services and programming to help mitigate or prevent COVID-19, you'll note in the 3rd bullet in the box, it says to prevent or mitigate COVID-19 in congregate living facilities, which does actually include jails. So there are some opportunities to potentially use some of this funding to help improve the situation for you all locally in the jail. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other items here. I'm not going to run through each one and read them to you unless you feel that I should, but there really are a lot of opportunities here to, broadly come up with ideas and options in order to help support that public health response if you feel that that's important. Oh, the one other thing I'll mention on this slide was the capital investments and adaptations in public facilities. So again, to the extent that a capital investment or adaptation in a public facility like a congregate living facility is helping to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, that is also an eligible use. Now here we talk about that a little bit more. The IFR, which is essentially the interim guidance from the Department of Treasury, does include incarceration settings in its definition of congregate settings. So you can see some of the things that they've mentioned, which is not an exhaustive list, but they've talked about improving ventilation, broadly supporting the prevention and mitigation, or making other capital investments. So we've talked about that a little bit. In terms of other ways that you can support the public health response, they being the Department of Treasury, specifically talk about covering payroll costs of public employees whose work is at least partially related to the pandemic. And it doesn't have to be, these are not meant to be funds that are spent to replace public employee payroll costs from before March of this year. It's meant to be in the future. So the ongoing expense of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you'll see that includes public safety individuals, it includes public health individuals, human services. So these are staff members that you have, for instance, you could help defer their payroll costs to the extent that they are helping to respond to the pandemic or COVID-19 more broadly. The way that Treasury does this is that they suggest that you can consider an employee dedicated to responding to the pandemic if the employee spends more than half of their time responding to the pandemic. But you might say, well, we probably don't have anyone that works within our government that spends more than half their time responding to the pandemic. Or maybe if you did, you only have very few. But what you can also do is if you decide that your public safety officers, for instance, are spending essentially, let's say 15% of their time or 20% of their time in one way or another dealing with issues related to the pandemic, as long as that person's supervisor can attest to the fact that that percentage of time is roughly spent on COVID-19 response and prevention, or is otherwise complicated by the presence of COVID-19, you can then offset that percentage of that person's costs using your state and local funds. So importantly, the reason why that might be useful for you all is that then if you're able to offset those public safety payroll costs, you can have potentially made other county funds that would have been spent on those payroll costs available to you to then address other priorities that you may have, which may not be allowable uses of these state and local funds. So I think that's an important note. Now, moving on to the second of 5 items for the allowable uses, and it's addressing negative economic impacts. And again, I think it's worth reminding you that we talked a little bit about some of the assistance that's been available through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan to both individuals, businesses, and other entities through a variety of other programs already. And so you want to be, I think I would suggest that the county wants to be mindful of some of those other assistance programs that have been made available so that you're essentially not duplicating benefits. But with respect to addressing negative impacts, economic impacts, the Department of Treasury does say that you can use your funds to cover economic impacts on small businesses or nonprofits. You can offer loans, grants, whether it's related to retaining employees, helping people pay their mortgages or rents, paying for utilities, et cetera, et cetera. You can also help with prevention and mitigation tactics related to COVID-19 to the extent that those are necessary. You can also use the funds, the Treasury says, to cover economic impacts of households and individuals that have been negatively impacted by the pandemic. And you'll note that there's a variety of ideas there that Treasury does mention. Again, some of these situations are covered by other programs. I'd note, for instance, rent, mortgage, and utility assistance. I know that there are federal agencies that are standing up a rent and mortgage assistance program right now because the eviction moratorium is expected to end fairly soon. And when that does, people will owe a lot of rent or maybe mortgage payments that they have been unable to make during the pandemic. But again, there's a multi-billion-dollar program that the federal government's going to be or is setting up right now, using local governments as conduit to help provide people with that kind of assistance, so that when the eviction moratorium goes away, that people have those funds on hand in order to make those payments. It is important to note that if you all decided to do, let's say, a food assistance program throughout the community, we just have to make sure that you're aware that the county would have to manage such a program. If you provided job training, for instance, to members of the community who have been negatively impacted by COVID-19, again, you need to set up and manage that program on an ongoing basis. And you'd want to consider what kind of staffing capacity you had in order to manage those efforts. With respect to continuing to address negative impacts, economic impacts, Treasury also discusses how you can rehire public sector staff in order to reach your pre-pandemic levels of staffing if the county had to lay folks off. So if you didn't have to lay folks off, then that's good, and we don't necessarily need to pay too much attention to this. But if you did, you can rehire some folks. You also can use the funds to help unemployed folks, receive additional assistance, get job training. We've talked a little bit about that. You can help with folks trying to transition from part-time work to full-time work. There's a wide variety of ways that you could set up programs to address these things. And last but not least, you can offer some funds to address negative economic impacts of impacted industries like tourism and travel, hospitality, entities that may have been impacted by the shutdowns and whatnot. There are some programs that both have been already made available to groups like these, and there are more programs coming. Specifically with respect to tourism, I want to mention that the Economic Development Administration has $750 million set aside for tourism industries specifically. They are working on getting those funds out the door. But again, that's another example of an industry that has a specific program that will be targeted to helping them. So we'll keep those things in mind as we solicit your feedback and talk about ideas for ways that you might want to expend your local funds. One of the things also the Treasury has determined, as I mentioned earlier, that you can use your funds on is replacing public sector revenue loss. So if the county experienced revenue loss using a very specific definition and very specific rules and guidelines, you could replace that revenue loss. In my conversations with your county administration team, I'm not sure that you're eligible to use the funds in this way because I don't believe that you experienced enough of a revenue loss, again, as defined by the Department of Treasury, to apply the funds in this way. So we don't have a lot of information on this, but certainly can get you all more if that's something you want to look into. The fourth item that the Treasury has determined you can spend the money on is premium pay for essential workers. So if the county should choose to do so, you would be allowed to provide what's known as premium pay, and basically a bonus to people who have been deemed to be essential workers during the pandemic. I think it's important to note that these are people who did have significant in-person interaction during the pandemic and therefore may have been at a higher risk of contracting the virus. It is not meant to provide additional funding to people who, like myself, for instance, have essentially been able to telework from home through the pandemic. And last but not least, you are allowed to make investments in certain specific types of infrastructure. You'll recall that I mentioned that Congress specifically mentioned water and sewer. They mentioned broadband. They do not mention things like transportation or other infrastructure investments. So an allowable use, for instance, in water and sewer is to pretty much do almost anything you'd want. They do have to be eligible under what are known as the Clean Water or Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Funds. But I'll be honest and tell you that covers a wide variety of uses with respect to water infrastructure. Notably, I want to mention that it does include planning activities, such as feasibility studies. I know that earlier this year, I had discussions with county administration with respect to some potential planning activities or feasibility studies for some of the sewer systems that the county manages and may own, if I recall, that may need some updating in the future. And so it could be that you all choose to make some investments in a study effort to determine sort of what's needed to improve those systems in the future and how, what kind of fees would be required to get there. And last but not least, broadband. Again, you can make specific investments in broadband. This is one of the items I think that Treasury has already commented on pretty specifically with respect to their frequently asked questions document. They've tried to expand the ability for people to invest in broadband more so than they had initially in the interim final rule that they proposed and the initial guidance. So they are suggesting that they're trying to make it easier to invest in broadband. I don't know if this is something that you all want to consider, but certainly this is an area where, should it be, we'd have to meet some very specific criteria, but I think we probably could get there if you wanted to make that kind of investment. Now, along with the funds that the county will receive, of course, we will have to do some reporting. I know the county auditor will be managing much of that. We will be certainly trying to support that effort remotely to the extent that we can. The first report that you all have to submit will be due August 31. It doesn't necessarily have to say too much. You are allowed to simply say, we've received the funds and we have yet to determine how we intend to spend them. And given the fact that it's the 19th of July, it's, and the covered period will be to July 31st, it's, I think, probably unlikely that you'll decide to spend much of these funds over the next 11 days or so. So more than likely, this initial report will simply state that you've received the funds and have yet to make any determinations as to how you'll spend them. And then after that, you will have quarterly project and expenditure reports. You can see some of the detail there. The first one will be due by October 31st, and then they'll occur quarterly, probably through at least the expenditure of all your funding or 2026. It's really unclear at this point how those will wrap up. I know that there are a number of communities across the country that are pretty concerned about sort of misspending the funds and then having those funds recouped later on. Certainly that's not the intention of anybody. I don't think even Department of Treasury, certainly they don't even want that outcome. So it's certainly part of our job to make sure that doesn't happen. And I think it's fairly unlikely. I think we'll be fine. So in terms of what's next for you all, again, we wanted to provide this overview to you so that you had a little bit of an idea of what the allowable uses are, what the program is, what timeline you're under. And then we can start to move to making decisions and, taking recommendations and then ultimately making decisions about how you all will be spending your funds. You did draw down the first half of your monies in May of this year. So those are in an account with the county. You will be eligible to receive the second half of your money at roughly the same time next year. Again, the Treasury did go through a public comment period on their initial guidance. That public comment period closed on Friday. I would anticipate that they'll be submitting a final rule, probably with ongoing frequently asked questions updates, and that will occur prior to the first reporting date, which I believe was the end of August. So we'll probably have more clarity soon from Treasury. And I think that, as we go along, things will even become more and more clear. Part of our effort is not only to keep you all up to speed thus far with all the changes that have occurred, but also to continue to keep you up to speed and make sure that you all are aware of what's eligible, what's not, and how that fits in with some of the ideas that the board and the public generate. So now, we're hoping to solicit some feedback to the extent that you all have it from, members of the board, the public. I think what we'd like to do is take that feedback from you, simply listen on our end, and then ultimately come back to you in several weeks and sit down again and talk more about some of your ideas and how they might fit into sort of a more comprehensive plan. Help you all sort of, make the best use of these funds and articulate that plan to the public. To the extent that you all want, we want to facilitate as much conversation between, you, the board, and the public to ensure that, everybody's voice is heard. And also, I think it's important to note that as there may be opportunities to, potentially bring in other sources of funding, whether it's from the state or federal governments due to other programs that are available, to help, with specific ideas from the community or to help leverage additional funds locally. We want to make sure that we share with you, additional funding opportunities, talk you through other options for funding ideas, things like that. So that's what our goal is at this point. And that's the end of the slideshow. And love to chat further and hear what you all have to say and feedback you have to provide.
Greg, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and see if there's anybody out there that's listening to the presentation in public to try to solicit those questions first, and then we'll go through the board exchange. Kylie, just double checking to see if there's anybody out there with questions for public comment specific to this presentation.
Chair, I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Okay, very good. And we'll circle back to the board. Does anybody want to kick us off? Questions for Greg at this time? Supervisor Berkowitz.
Thank you. Greg, can you talk a little bit about broadband? We have received apparently $2.7 million in May. Can any of that be used for broadband? Or what are the limited uses that we can use that $2.7 million for?
Well, number one, you can use it for broadband. I think you're going to have to be eventually a little bit more specific as to what kinds of outcomes you hope to achieve. Again, there are some specific limitations with respect to broadband, but I think that if that is a board priority, it might then be worth diving deeper into the details. It's not so much that we need to dive much deeper into them at this point, but that we would certainly need to come back to you once we've heard that you'd like to invest in broadband and you have XYZ goals, then we can come back to you and say, that's not eligible, but maybe this is, or if you want to do this kind of thing, you have to meet these guidelines and specifications for your broadband deployment. idea. So Supervisor,
two-
that's, go
All right,
ahead.
that $2.7 million that we received in May, what specifically does that have to go for?
Well, there are 5 eligible uses. So we just ran through, most of them. And again, they are broad. And you basically have the opportunity to come up with ideas. But just to repeat, if I may, the 5 eligible uses are, I'm sorry, I'm actually just trying to get back to the slide so I can read them to you again. Supporting the public health response, addressing negative economic impacts, replacing public sector revenue loss, which I don't think you're eligible for, I don't believe. You can provide premium pay for essential workers. And last but not least, investments in water, sewer, or broadband. So those are the 5 things. Now, granted, there's quite a bit of leeway within those uses, but that's kind of where we're headed.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. Let's get back to that public sector revenue loss. You've said now twice that we're not eligible, but there's been clear losses in second quarter TOT revenues. Even though our TOT was up for a 12-month period, our second quarter revenue losses for April, May, June were 0. We had no income basically for those periods of time with TOT. Do you see that as qualifying then? That is a public revenue and a loss from lack of tourism to our community.
Right,
I
so-
don't see how it could escape the definition set forth by Treasury.
I'd like to ask the county administrator to also weigh in here because I think he's helped take a look at this specific option.
Actually, there's a specific formula that has to be used by the Auditor Controller's Office to do that analysis. And I think they're currently doing that. Based on the initial feedback, the overall, based on the formula that's used, the loss of revenue wasn't there.
It's because they're annualizing it versus looking at it on a month by month basis. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Well, that's pretty screwed. Please.
How I understood it, and I could be wrong, isn't it from March 2021 forward for loss, or can it be retro back to when the pandemic first started?
So this was the prior year, actually.
Okay. So if there were public sector revenues lost, it could be retroactive to back then. Okay,
That's
I was
correct,
just
but-
confused on that part.
But I do think it's correct that, as the county administrator accurately said, it is an annualized account. So Supervisor Howard, to your point, they're not saying that, well, you had 1 bad month or 2 bad months, and therefore we repay you. You can repay yourself for those months because it may have been better later on in the year.
Yeah, we clearly had a bad quarter. There was no revenue generated. But the remaining year, fortunately, because restrictions lifted in various sectors, those revenues were realized and realized tenfold in some cases. So I could see how a formula might mess us up in this situation. That's too bad. Other questions for Greg at this time?
Yeah, hi, Greg. This is Jerry Hemmingsen. Yeah, I don't have any questions really. I think you laid things out quite well on our direction. I think, we've certainly got more places to spend the money than we have money. And I think in order for us to get the biggest bang for our buck, we're going to want to leverage, and we're going to want to utilize these funds that will help us into the future. So I think that's the list that we need to come up with, and then the board will give direction at that point once we have this list in hand. So great presentation. Looks like we have a lot of flexibility, and looking forward to coming up with some projects.
Yeah. Neil, has staff begun to put together some semblance of a plan, or were you basically waiting for board discussion before a plan got put in? A draft plan in some respects was put in place for us to review.
Yeah, we've been working with Thorn Run on the allowable uses and things that actually apply most to Delaware County and how it can benefit us. Similar to what Supervisor Hemmingsen just said, we're looking at trying to do what we can to offset some of the allowable costs that will give us leverage for other general fund dollars to address some of the other issues in the county.
Has some of the 2.7 been spent at this point in time?
No.
So
nothing
how
yet.
is that money being utilized? Is it in the treasurer's office?
Yep, currently sitting in the treasury, waiting for
Is it
direction from the
growing
board and a
interest?
plan. So through this process, what we're doing is this is just another revenue source. It's a one-time revenue source,
Yep.
basically. And so we're looking to put together a plan for its expenditure over the next 3 to 4 fiscal years.
Yeah, I think as discussed by Greg and Supervisor Hemmingsen, finding ways to offset potentially general fund expenses, which would even allow us more flexibility, is something we should all be considering in great detail. I do appreciate Greg going into some additional detail on our incarceration type facilities and use of those funds. I think that was pretty important for the board to hear. Okay. Okay, well, it appears that we have no more comments from the board. Staff, do you have any other conversations you'd like to have with Greg at this time?
Nothing at this time, other than just saying thanks to Greg and Geneve and the rest of their team to who put this presentation together for the board and our community.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Greg. Appreciate you joining us today. It's always a pleasure.
I did just want to say one quick thing. So the
You bet.
intent, again, just to be very clear, is that we will work with your administrative team and the rest of the county staff to come up with some different ideas, which we intend then to present back to you. And I do, Supervisor Howard, want to make sure that you know that you are allowed to put this in an interest-bearing account, the money that you have, and you are allowed to collect that interest and keep it for yourself. So that is an intent of the Treasury. So just to clarify that point.
Yeah. And if you want to lobby for some change in that ridiculous formula that was given to us, you could certainly do so, because I think that's a push.
I would like to expand on that a little bit. What Greg just mentioned is that we do plan on coming back to the board in August with another special meeting like this to address going forward with some specific plan for the local recovery funds.
Excellent. Good work. Great work, Greg. Really appreciate your help on this.
Happy to help, always.
All right. Well, this pretty much wraps us up and we're adjourned. Thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next regularly scheduled board meeting.
Thank you all.
Thank you.